And hello, gentlemen. Is this thing working?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me today for a discussion about should a BC application consultant learn about AL? And why don't we start with some introductions to let everyone know who you are? So, Inge, why don't you start? One moment. My apologies. I'm being told that your audio is not coming through. So, okay. So, yeah, chat is saying that they can hear me but can't hear you. One moment. Let me try and work on this. This is the one thing we did not check for. Okay. My apologies. Technical difficulties. So, can you do a quick sound check, Inga? Just say something. Okay. Yep. I see your levels. It is not. Oh, here we go. Okay. So, Inga, why don't you do another sound check?
Yes. Can you hear me now? One, two, three, one,
Okay.
two, three.
Chat, can you hear him now? I had one button wrong out of the 6,300 buttons.
Still nothing.
Okay. There's a delay. It looks like it's showing on my end. Here, let me unmute on YouTube. Okay. So, Inga, what? Okay.
Yes,
Got it.
let's.
Yep. It is coming through now. So,
It's
okay.
coming through now.
Thank you,
Yes.
chat. That is the value of a live stream. Otherwise, we might have had a very interesting conversation at the end of this. So, my apologies for the interruption. So, Inga, why don't you start over with your introduction?
Yes. I can do that. And first of all, thank you for having us here, Steve. Yes, my name is Inge Bruvik. I'm working for CGI in Norway as a Business Central consultant slash developer. So I'm trying to do both. I have been working with Dynamics NIV Navision Business Central since about 1996. And even before that, I worked with PC Plus. That was the product that these Navision guys made before they made Navision and Navigator
Wow.
and all the good old stuff. So I've
Veteran.
been doing this for a very long time.
Wow. Okay. Excellent. Okay. And Mark.
Hi, everybody. Steve, thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it. My name is Marc Tweedie. I am a developer working for a company, Cisco Software, in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I'm a newbie, really. I've been a developer for 8 years almost for Cisco. And yeah, getting better every day. Every day is a school day in all
And
respects.
and those 8 years, have they been focused on NAV and now BC, or have you done other
Yes,
things?
I've only ever worked in NAV and IBC.
Okay, excellent. Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining me, and thank you everyone for watching live here. And of course, this is going to be recorded and available on YouTube and podcast and Twitter and every other place I can think of. So, why don't we jump in? Let me increment the slides a couple. And a quick note, if I can figure this out. There we go. So, a quick note that this topic was started on Twitter, which we'll get into, but it has turned into a session submission for DynamicsCon. So we're just going to have a general discussion today about the topic and see what we think about this. But Inga and I are going to consolidate this into a formal presentation to share some findings and thoughts and benefits and pros and cons and how this might contribute to a consulting organization that works with Business Central. So if you haven't yet, head on over to dynamicscon.com and vote before January 19th, 2022 to choose the sessions that you want to see at DynamicsCon. And if you are interested in this topic, then you can certainly vote for our session, but make sure to vote for all the things that are interesting to you. So with that shameless plug, let's move to how this started. So Inge, can you share, here I have a screenshot of the tweet that started quite a conversation based on your blog post at bc365.co. Can you share like what the background was or what prompted you to write this particular blog post?
Well, I decided to start a blog back in December. I didn't want it to be one of those blogs that has this one post where they say, I'm going to start a blog. And then when you revisit it 3 months later, that's the only post that is there. So I kind of tried to flush it with a couple of posts to kind of kick it off. And of course, this is the topic that have been discussed in every, I think, partner organization I have been working with through the years. And it's a topic that I still discuss with my colleagues and with my manager when we are going to hire new people. And we discuss it between my colleagues. And I think that it is an important topic to discuss. And I think it's an important topic to have an opinion around and have a, how should I say, to think through when you build a Business Central organization.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and I think I have always been doing both the consulting part of the product and the developer part of the product. But of course, I think it's of course most important for a consultant to really know the functionality of the product. So my intention behind the post was never to try to tell that every Business Central consultant should be a full-blown developer.
Right. And we saw varying opinions on this, which was very interesting. And so here's the title of the blog post. I am a Business Central consultant. Do I need to know anything about AL programming? And people interpreted this in very different ways, as we saw. And that often happens on Twitter. You'll just drop a thought out there and people will go in a direction that, like, I didn't even think of that possibility. And it goes strange places, but it raises some interesting questions. Now, you kind of explained that where you have worked and your role, you do both. And we also saw some comments on Twitter saying the same thing, that people were trained in their organization that you didn't write a single line of code until you knew the application, and vice versa. You didn't, dig in the application without also understanding the code. They went very hand in hand, and I'm guessing that was very a traditional Navision practice, and that was also emphasized as part of their formal training programs back then. In the U.S., in my experience, it has been very much a functional consultant or application consultant and a technical consultant, and those are often two different roles, and it is, in my experience, very common for the application consultant to say, sorry, I don't write code. And like that's allowed or accepted, or it's just normal. And I think we can discuss whether that's good or bad and some of the potentially missed opportunities that can occur. So, so with that, I guess, Marc, what has your experience been with role of, say, a functional or application consultant versus technical? Have you seen something where those are two different roles, or does your organization combine them?
No, we're very much separate. We have a team of developers and team of consultants. As developers, I think we do try and learn a lot about the product. I think it makes us better developers, really. So I think Business Central and Nav both quite unique in that respect, and that knowing the product really does help you be a better developer for that product. We have consultants who, how do I put this? They are not technical, and they are functional consultants that are quite happy to be like that. We have other consultants who like to dig in and find out what's going on under the bonnet, under the hood, if you like. There are benefits to both of those things, I think, from on a consultant's point of view. It can be very helpful for a developer, for the consultant to know a bit about what's going on in the background. In terms of getting like that functional spec through, and actually knowing what the data structure is like, the technologies available to deliver that spec correctly for the customer, and also then to help the customer understand what they can get from the product.
Yes, I totally agree. And we had a little conversation in advance, and several points there that I think we can definitely dig into. So I will show a few quotes from Twitter that I pulled. There were 20 or 30 replies, so I just grabbed 4 that were kind of thoughtful. So Waldo shared in his typical joking manner, a developer that implements BC is as dangerous as a functional consultant that develops, but together they can form a great team. I would agree. And I think we'll see a common theme of there was kind of a jump to a conclusion that kind of assumed that you implied that an application consultant or a functional consultant should be doing active development. And I don't think that's what you were trying to convey. Like in your blog post, which I have a screenshot later, you mentioned, hey, application consultant should try to maybe sit down, do a few hands-on labs, and just kind of experience this. And it wasn't an implication that they should be an expert or do this on a day-to-day business basis or have any coding deliverables, right? It was more to just learn the practice, kind of understand the structures.
That's correct. And that is because I think part of the success that Navision and later Business Central became to is because it is a product that can be customized, and that is kind of in the DNA of the system. So at least in my experience, we don't deliver any Business Central implementation where there's no customizations at all. So it is always a part of our deliverables, and therefore I think that the consultants should know about how is the process of actually writing code, publishing it to the tenant, a little bit about maintaining it, and also maybe the most important of it is knowing about the object types, maybe something about the field type, so they can actually have that in mind when they discuss with the customer what is possible to do in the system and how can we achieve it.
Yep.
Because very often there is no developer present when you have the workshop with your customers, when you discuss should we do it this way or that way, or what data are we going to enter here, and what is the output we want out of this.
Yeah, then the conversations can come a bit later down the line where the developer gets involved and says that's maybe not the best way to do something, and then you have to go back to the customer, and it can lengthen the process unnecessarily.
Yeah, or even worse, the developer just takes what the proposal says verbatim, and there goes your budget, right? Or maybe it costs 50% more than if the developer had proposed a different technique, different design approach. There might have been a simpler solution given the technical constraints or opportunities in the system. So another quote from Willem is, I think functional consultants should read code but not write it, which I think goes to kind of your intent of your blog post. if somebody casually writes some code, then eventually developers will have to maintain, debug, and extend it. And I think this is a common sentiment among the elite developer class, shall we say, who does not want to have to deal with the horrible code that is written off the cuff by someone who is not, I mean, understandably is not, say, trained or practiced or skilled in development, because it does get complex. And I've had many cases where it's like, oh, this is just a simple little customization. And it turns into something that is still being maintained 10 years later. And so something little turns into something big, and it just becomes harder to deal with over time. So
they often say it's like a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, and that goes for developers and the application as well.
Yep.
So yeah, we've certainly seen maybe rogue code that maybe isn't doing exactly what it should, and yeah, you do have to maintain that. But equally on the other side, I've seen developers do things with the application, we're maybe changing fields, removing values in order to get past an error message, which is actually then broken the application. So it definitely goes both ways.
Yeah, that is important. That I also think it's very important that the developers actually know a whole lot about the functionality in the system to be able to write the code and kind of do things the Business Central way. So they don't break anything of the standard functionality or do something that we end up with a user interface that is totally different from the rest of the system.
Even trying to make a system that suits the customer. I mean, it's something that we always talk about is making sure the customer experience is a good one, the user experience is a good one. And for that, I think the developers need to understand what the system does and what it actually needs to do at the end of the process. So something we've started doing recently in our company is actually developers get to go out on site and have a walk around, like a shop floor, for example. So recently I had my first ever visit to a shop floor as a pet food manufacturer in Northern Ireland, and we got to go and just walk around the production line, and I understand what it means when they are saying, oh, we're putting this pallet label on right here. You have 20 seconds to print it. This is what happens, and that I have to say that's a fantastic thing for us. Like, it's really, really good.
Those are my favorite. I absolutely love those. In the few cases I've been able to do it, it was the most enjoyable aspect of consulting, is seeing how these businesses operate on the production side, right? Not just the accountants at their desk doing financial transactions. So that was great. So Ted said, lots you can do to help clients without AL knowledge. But when you get into business analysis, understanding the basics of objects and the data model can help. You may not be able to code, but at least ask the right questions. And I think this is kind of the sentiment that really gets to the point of the value that you mentioned in your blog post, because you don't necessarily need to be a coding expert. You're not dealing with, code units and functions and procedures and return types. It's like, hey, I know that I think you had mentioned in our prior call, I know what a code field means. Like, I know what that means. And I could say, on this custom window, maybe we should use a code field for this field in order to have these benefits and this data structure behind the scenes. And another one that I've come across is, well, if the user selects this field, maybe we should disable that field. And being explicit with that in a specification so the developer knows, these are alternative choices. And just the simple things of enabling or disabling a field, having defaults, having validation, just those basics of the development options, I think greatly enhance design, proposals, estimates, communication with the developer.
Yeah, and it is very much about the communication with the developer. It's important to have kind of a common language when you talk with developers, I think, and writing specifications are really hard. It's really hard. I think it's really hard. I've done it for a lot of years, but I think it's really hard to write my specification in a way that I can pretty much just slide them under the door to the developer and expect them to do what I had in mind when I wrote it.
That's our dream, right?
Yeah, that's our dream. And I think that was some of the developers that responded to the Twitter also, was that they want the consultants to focus on the functional part, on the business processes, and really write those excellent specifications. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that I've heard from a developer that, this didn't go well because the specification was not clear enough. I think that is a very common statement from the developer side, and I've used it myself too. And that is what I'm kind of trying to avoid. I want them to be able to talk together and communicate together in a way that we kind of achieve what we have promised the customer that we should deliver to them.
And just last night, I had a conversation where we were doing a code review for a customization, and the developer asked a simple question. How do you have this requirement here, but there's nothing in the statement of work that explains how this is implemented. And it turns out that one sentence needed to have 2 or 3 additional fields on the window that were not discussed. And that's something that just understanding the implications of a data structure or how the application or customization might work, I should have known that, right? And it's like, I should have realized that requirement spawned a need for 2 or 3 additional fields, which required another layer of validation to enable or disable this field. And it's like, it really brings it home. So unless the application consultant or someone writing the specification or the quote or whatever is kind of aware of what the developer is dealing with, and they can have some empathy, I mean, they can drop a document on the developer's desk, and then the developer's left guessing in many areas as to how to best implement this solution.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always think it's something we talk about is what assumed knowledge is expected of developers in terms of what they should know to put in a change request, or as we would call them, our sort of short order changes. We do something, we should know to do this because it's what we do. And yeah, that there's discussions definitely go on around that for us. And we try and make it as explicit as possible. I just as in a consultant's point of view, would you expect developers to have a lot of assumed knowledge, or are you happy to explicitly declare everything that is required in the spec?
In my experience, I think that there is an expectation that developers understand the product functionality. They don't necessarily need to be an expert of every field, every window, every business process, but they need to understand the job journals, these journals, how the transaction flows. And I mean, they're having to deal with all the development stuff plus all the fundamental application functionality. Whereas in many cases, I've seen application consultants say, nope, that sounds moderately technical. I give up. That's not my realm. And it's like, there's a little bit of imbalance in my experience based on the products I've worked with.
Mm. And I totally agree with you, Steve. I think we should expect the developers to know pretty much about how the system is working. For instance, that when you do a sales order, that ends up like a posted sales invoice, and know that flow, that's the way Business Central works. We create a document and then we post it, and then it's deleted as a sales order, and then it becomes a posted sales invoice. So I think it's important to know those key aspects. And I know, Steve, you have been struggling with the dimensions the last week, and also that they understand how is the general chart of accounts and dimension, and how does they function together and work together. And there are some key aspects of the Business Central application that I think it's very important that developers actually understand quite a lot about.
And trying to deal with transactions in Business Central without understanding dimensions, as I'm learning, it's kind of tricky. And then the second you step into understanding dimensions, whoa, okay, like it goes in so many directions. Just we wanted to look into defaulting a dimension. Like it's a really, really tricky, slightly dangerous place to go. And we said, we're not going to do it because we saw all the complications and directions that we might have to handle. We said, nope, it's just dangerous territory. Let's let Business Central handle that, and we'll have very limited functionality to we'll support what we can of dimensions, but we're not going to provide full validation and defaulting on our end. And that made our lives easier. And we'll see how that works out, right? If a customer asks for it, we'll reconsider. But
we can also take another example. If you are a consultant and you look at the flow field and not understanding what the flow field actually is and how it works, how are you going to propose to the customer that, okay, maybe we should have the flow field here?
Classic
if you don't understand
example.
anything about how they are built and how they work,
why
very
can't
hard.
I see quantities on hand by site? Why is that so hard? Come on, Steve. I'm calling the item API. Why doesn't it have quantities by site? And that conversation where you try to explain that none of those like quantity on hand values exist in fields in a database. They're all just calculated on the fly. And that's a customization. They're like, wait a minute. You have this big set of software and it can't even tell me what quantity I have at this site. I mean, and so, it's that typical conversation. You mean your fancy software can't do this one little simple thing? And it's not that it can't, it's just that, that's a customization to the API. And it's not a hard customization once you know how. But so a final point here, and I think it is a valid point, having dealt with on development skill set. Being a BC consultant developer these days is not easy. I totally agree. I can't imagine how consultants could keep up the pace trying to learn AL, all the new features in Business Central, and all the other stuff BC uses like Azure, Power Apps, Power BI, etc. And I would agree in the sense that, yes, it's a lot of stuff, but back to your post, the goal was not to have current, active, like code cowboys slinging AL left and right and delivering extensions. It was, hey, know the fundamentals, right? The data types are not changing daily. The concept of a table and a page not changing daily. Flow fields, right? These are very fundamental base level concepts that you're not having to keep up with the latest, breaking change in 20.1 or 20.2 or whatever.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And it's just and an awareness of the technologies available to do these. So we mentioned Azure, and about file management and that kind of thing when it comes to a SaaS implementation. Awareness of that rather than being able to do it is important.
Yeah, and I mean, just like I know Belinda and others in the chat have mentioned Power Automate and Power Apps, and you don't necessarily need to be an expert in those, and an AL developer may not have any experience with those, but if an application consultant say, well, given what you're trying to do, Power Automate might be an option for this integration you need. And at a minimum, they can know that they can prototype that integration potentially, and in 30 minutes have a working functional prototype proof of concept showing how data can flow between systems, and then hand that to a developer. Say maybe Power Automate isn't the final solution, but then the developer can say, I see the source, I see the destination, I see the field mappings. Cool, now I know exactly what you want, and I can code that in AL using whatever toolset makes sense. So definitely an option. So Dynamics Pro Services 365 says, I'm a functional consultant that does a lot of AL code. So interesting mix of skill sets. The combination of the two has allowed me to deliver solutions that are high quality, low cost, and delivered quickly at the same time. Yeah, that's the ideal, right? When you can do both, you wear multiple hats. And while I do appreciate that, I've done that as well, it's hard to scale those skills. Not as many people in my experience have both of those skill sets. And so I'm only one person. So how many people in an organization can be good at both of those skill sets? That's often a challenge for organizations, right?
Very, very few, I think. Very few can manage to do both. But we should also understand that not all the Business Central developers are those guru developers. I mean, there are flowing a lot of people into the Business Central community and the Business Central channel that is kind of average developers, and we need to be able to communicate with them as well. And I mean, Business Central has became a very much more open system now than it was some years ago. When I first was trained as a Navision developer, I had to go through, I think it was a week of training, and then I was handed kind of my personal development license on a floppy disk, and I was told that I had to renew it every year in order to be able to still develop. So things have been changing. Today you can do kind of Business Central development, and you can do Business Central consulting as well without basically any mandatory training anymore.
Yeah, good point. And to your point, average is not a criticism of these people coming into business. Average is by definition the average, right? So not all developers or application consultants are going to be rock stars, even in their own, realm, right? And so to have an expectation that a majority of a consulting staff can do both may be a stretch. It just may not be possible for people to span those divides, right?
Yeah, and in my company, I'm basically the only one who is doing it. So it isn't anything that I think you should build your organization around. But I think that concept, understanding those concepts for a consultant, is critical in my eyes.
Excellent. Okay, so we have another slide here. So I wanted to transition to the discussion of some of the pros of this philosophy of application consultants learning a little bit about development. What are some potential cons, and what are some related topics? I have a few examples, and I'm sure each of you have some. And I just included a little snippet from your blog post. And the idea was that what are some basic AL or developer tasks an application consultant might learn in order to better understand the technical side? So uploading an app, pretty simple, right? Creating a basic AL project in Visual Studio Code. And I think that alone gives an application consultant some empathy for the developer, right? Just getting that basic AL hello world project, like, wait a minute, you need to do these 97 things just to say hello world. Are you kidding me? Right? For someone who's new, I went through this for 2 years, right? It's like, you have got to be kidding me. And trying to explain what it takes to get a Docker container spooled up on a laptop or something, if an application consultant goes through that, I think they'll have some empathy for what it takes to set up an environment, do testing, things like that.
Yeah, can I just, it also comes back as well to what Nav was like, coding in CL, where you just go in and drop a line of code in to wherever you like, and that's just a one-line change. That one-line change isn't necessarily a one-line change anymore. Been bitten by that one a few times during upgrades and so on. That what was very simple, and perhaps a consultant still perceives to be very simple, is no longer as straightforward. And all of a sudden, it's not 10 minutes; it's maybe 2 hours or whatever. It's it's trying to get that. I don't want to call it appreciation, because I don't want to. It's not that we want to be appreciated. It's an understanding, of what's required now, as opposed to what we used to be able to do quite simply.
Right. And just having been through it, just like those shop floor walks where you can see and understand how that customer operates, having some experience, even just through a hands-on lab of seeing what the developer goes through and some of the processes, I think it's helpful at least to have some shared empathy there. Know what object types we're working with in Business Central. Inge, you mentioned that. Write a simple page and report extensions. Yep. I mean, very simple stuff. It could be just a simple, hello world type demonstration, proof of concept. It doesn't have to be anything functional, but yes, just the process. So with that, I just arbitrarily listed a few cons that came to the top of my head, starting with cons. Functional consultants should focus on the app and business process. We saw that on the Twitter thread, right? We just saw a quote, the application is more than enough for person to learn and keep up with. And this, by the same token, the development skill sets and development changes are enough for a developer to keep up with. That's too much for them to try to branch over onto the other side and learn both. Frequent refrain by developers is non-developers could write bad code, which then becomes a nightmare to maintain. And I think the moderating thought for all of these is the point is not to necessarily make application consultants into rockstar developers or even have them write production code. It's simply to experience some of the fundamentals, learn some of the terminology so that you have a shared language for discussion with customers, proposals, requirements, specifications, statement of work, quotes, all of that process for delivering a solution or a customization to a customer. Just a little bit of fundamental background knowledge could be helpful.
Yes. Just to ignite their curiosity, so to say, and I think we should encourage them kind of to have their own little AL project that they can, when they are between assignments. I see no harm in them going into their own little sandbox project and try to do some stuff to broaden their horizon, so to say. And on the same. And I think developers should do the same. If you are between assignments, take an hour and go into the base application, see how it's working, try some buttons, see what's happened, try to understand what happens. I mean, it's just to try to broaden your view of things that makes this whole process easier, I think, and more efficient.
Definitely. And as a developer, I kind of miss how easy it is for consultants to add things like flow fields to tables and fields to pages and so on. It used to be all those little bits of work were off my plate. But now nearly every tiny request has to come through a developer in order to get deployed. So those basic skills would be useful. I should also say that developers can write bad code too. I've seen plenty and written plenty myself. So it's not just the consultants would write bad code.
Yes, just as we discussed the term average. Yeah, I can attest that I am not a rockstar developer. I've been writing.
Me neither. No.
I've been writing code for how many years, and I'm not going to impress some hardcore .NET developer with my C#. But you know what? My code is very basic. It's very simple. It works. Now, if I had to extend it over 10 years, does it extend terribly well? Probably not. I have several cases to demonstrate that. But for the majority of my customers, is it perfectly functional? Yes. So yes, fair point. Not all developers are rock stars. So we can't necessarily bag on application consultants or someone who writes bad code, right?
Definitely not.
So, okay. So let's move on to the potential pros. And I think there are more of these personally for when an application consultant learns a little bit more about development skill sets, tools, and fundamentals. For example, the more someone understands about the overall system, and that's the entire Business Central stack, from application pages to the flow fields and data structures, to the APIs, to how the environment works in a SaaS world. That's my focus as BC SaaS. I think the better they can implement, design, and communicate with customers and colleagues, be it application consultants or developers. So just the fundamental communication skills of understanding, okay, I understand this concept, therefore we can talk on the same level that, yes, I understand this is a flow field, and I understand therefore that I can't just slap this field on a report easily. It may need to be added to a report, to an API, whatever, right? So communication, I think, is a huge, huge benefit there. An application consultant who has some understanding of AL can better understand customization options, limitations, and better communicate with developers. So if one very simple example is there are fast tabs on BC SaaS pages now. And so, hey, I know that I can have fields grouped in a fast tab. I know that I can have fields with the show more, show less, visible or non-visible. And I know that, well, maybe these 3 fields or 4 fields, they need to get pulled out into their own little fast tab or group to help improve the UI. Just really simple requests like that a developer can do in 5 minutes, right? They can just reorganize the grouping on the page. And if the application consultant knows how easy that is, understands that as a fundamental design option, they can deliver potentially much better solutions to customers.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of things like that where there's maybe a lot of default settings that come into a business cycle implementation, but actually to change those, it's really no trouble. Just no one ever thought to look at it. I'm then thinking of like on a page where you would have the primary key fields at the top as the identifier, but you can change those, and that's been useful certainly for me. But we didn't really know it existed until someone tried to do it. So there are a lot of things that we just haven't done it where it actually would have been very useful, but now we know about it, and that will continue to make use of it.
And I think, go ahead, Inge.
Yeah, and we can't, as consultant, we can't expect the developers to do those things unless we specify it to them.
Right.
And I can just write, okay, I want this screen with these fields, and then I can't just expect the developers to actually do those fast tabs and make sure that the user interface get really user friendly unless I have told them something about how I think that should be done, or kind of wrote to them that you have to make sure that this gets usable in some way. And I'm sure there are developers out there that will do that automatically because they have done this for so long and they are kind of those rock stars that we are talking about. But again, the average developer will not do it unless it's specified.
Yes, and I was about to make the same point. I don't frequently encounter situations where a developer looks at a specification and says, or maybe partially through the development says, hey, would it make sense for this to be reorganized or this to be different? Like they're usually just consuming the specification or the proposal or whatever the document is and following that because they just often don't have the best solution is. And so I think those conversations can be super valuable, and it can make the difference between a perfectly fine, usable customization and a really valuable customization that adds value to the customer. And without that communication and feedback from the developer, sometimes that just won't happen.
Correct.
So, aside from pros and cons, we did talk about developers are often expected to know the application, but functional consultants are often not expected to have technical skills or expertise. And I have a story that I just had with a colleague this week or last week where I think this makes a point. It wasn't about AL, but we were working, she had a question about a Business Central report. And she was trying to perform a calculation or I forget what the term is on the report, but it's like, if this field is greater than this, then show or hide this other field. So it's a conditional statement, right? And it just wasn't working. And so through the call, we reverse engineered how all those expressions are listed. Like now, when you pull up a Business Central report, all you see is EXPR 01, EXPR 37. And it's just this mass of nonsensical EXPRs. And I've seen that as well. And it's been intimidating to me because I'm like, what is this? So we took the time to say, okay, wait a minute. This isn't working. What is this EXPR business? We looked at the function and I realized it was doing a split. And I was like, a split of what? So we just kept working step by step backwards. We realized it's doing a split of a string with some bizarre delimiter of ASCII character 177 or whatever that is. And I'm like, what in the world? Because this was all new to me. Anyone who's done the Business Central reports, you guys may be familiar with this, but I was like, this is utterly bizarre. But then we reverse engineered to the point where we got to the base string that was being parsed, and we saw it in one field. And I said, both of our light bulbs went on, and we said, oh, that's what this entire thing is doing? Are you kidding me? And now that application consultant, because she understands what that expression formula is doing, that it's doing a split, it's just parsing some like horribly long, undecipherable string that just has concatenated fields. Now she's able to see and pick the field she wants, and she knows exactly how to do it because we reverse engineered the design of that report. And now everything crystallized. And it's like, now she is so much more effective when she looks at a report, and it just vastly increased the value that she can provide to customers, right? Instead of saying, I don't know, we're not sure, we'll have to figure that out. She's like, oh, here, let me figure that out. It wasn't programming, right? She's not writing code. It's like now she just understands the architecture behind that report and how to decipher it, right? So any other anecdotes that where you've seen the application consultant have an aha moment because they figured out some technical aspect?
I have a lot of them myself, but because when I don't understand anything in an application, I try to go back to the code and see what actually happening, and that helps me learn those nitty-gritty details of the functionality that I wouldn't be able to learn because the documentation is getting better around Business Central, but it's still not perfect. So some things you actually have to go back to the code to really, really, really understand how it's working. And I saw you did the same thing around the default dimension things when you tried to explore how that is working. So that just the skill of being able to pull up the object and just read what is really going on there is very important when you have these, how is this really working? The documentation is kind of vague and you have, and you need to really understand it. And it's the only way you can really understand it is to go to the code and see it for yourself.
Yeah, and I've certainly seen that with customizations, maybe something that was written 15, 20 years ago for which there is no documentation and it's always just worked. And all of a sudden, it maybe doesn't work exactly as expected. And for the consultant to be able to go in and certainly attempt to read what's happening there can be really useful for us because then they're maybe able to relay that to customers, get an expectation of what it should do, and then maybe we're able to go as developers go in and maybe help fix it. Can be very useful.
I now that you remind me of that, just looking at the code. And you don't have to be an expert, right? Just being able to pull up the code. I have had several situations where that would have helped the application consultant solve a baffling problem they were experiencing. I believe it was Mary Thompson was trying to import vendors or retrieve vendor information from the Business Central API. And she said, why is this 1099 information always blank? And 1099 relates to a tax code that we have in the US. And so I pulled it up and I was like, the field is there, but behind the scenes in the API code, you can clearly see it's hard-coded to return an empty string. And we were like, what? And so knowing that, that explained it. And it turns out that that field should not have been included because they didn't want to do any region specific or tax, country tax specific fields. And that one was mistakenly added. And there are others where it's like, why is this doing this? And we go in and look, it's like, oh, this field named this is really a flow field that pulls this value. And it's not what you think it is, right? You see this quantity field and you're like, why is this wrong? And then you go look at the code and you see where the flow field's pulling data from. And you're like,
definitely seen that before. Yeah.
I had one regarding the chart of accounts and the trial balance reports. You have this balance and you have balance at date, and just those two simple fields to really understand why is the one changing when I set the date filter? Why is the other one not changing when I set the date filter? And if I filter on balance different from 0, doesn't show me the accounts that I was expecting it to, and you kind of have to understand. And when I was writing a blog post around that the other week, and to be really sure that I wrote it correctly, I had to actually go into the code and see, oh, is this really happening? So it's very useful skill to have, to be able to at least know in the object designer where to find the object and be able to pull it up and just scroll through it to see what is going on. And that isn't really hard.
Yeah, I am not a proficient, I'm not even a proficient AL developer, but I can at least pull up the code and reviewing it, have a vague idea of what it's doing, and then I'll just see a field name and it's like, there's your problem, right? There are two quantity fields or two code fields or unit fields or whatever it is. And it's like, I thought it was pulling from here. It's really pulling from this other very similarly named field. And that crystallized like, oh, okay, that makes sense now. And now you need to pull a different field or do a customization or whatever the case is. So,
or fields that have been recaptioned have certainly caught out a few times.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Yes. In the US version, I found that they call it something like quantity on hand, but the field behind it is a totally different field. Mm-hmm. And we see the caption in BC, but the API is pulling from a different place. We're like, oh my gosh, I just spent 2 hours trying to figure out why the value was wrong, right? It's because the fields, the translated caption is different for the US version than the actual underlined field. Perfect point right there.
I think I had this with commodity codes and tariff numbers when Brexit was on the go, and I was like looking for whichever way around it was. I was like, what is this? Where is this field? I can't see it anywhere. It was a caption issue. Yeah.
And even in Page Inspector, I saw the translated caption and I thought that was the field name. I had to go down to like the API level and the code level to realize that the field name is actually something different. And so the US version may be different from the UK version or, the Belgian version. So just understanding that as an application consultant, those gotchas, I think it's very valuable. Well, any great conversation. Thank you both. Any closing thoughts or other gems you'd like to share?
I think
putting you on the spot here.
Well, I think that there is a lot of great technical work done in the Business Central channel, but what I'm missing is kind of a little more focus. Where you combine the technical side with the functional side, because there are a lot of developers that are very focused on all the technical possibilities in the product these days, and I kind of missing those more discussions around why are we doing this AL development? We are doing it to create some business value for the customers. So what can we do kind of far out there on the edge of breaking technology, instead of how are we going to apply this for the users in the product. So that's an important thing that I would suggest new people that are coming into the business channel to focus on creating business value with your code, and really make sure that you work through the strengths of Business Central and not spend all your time trying to fix all the weakness in the system. I think you will deliver much more better solutions if you work through the strengths of the system.
Yeah, I have to agree. You know, it's a great product, and as a product in itself, yes, we can do lots of fancy stuff, but quite often it doesn't need to be fancy. You know, you're trying to deliver value. You're trying to deliver a product for you that you're usable for your customer, and that is the end goal, regardless of how you get there. A lot of the time, it's as a developer, it's fun to use the new stuff. It's fun to look into the new stuff, trying to put it into practice. I really do enjoy that aspect of it. But the end goal is, you want to deliver a good system. You want to think you're making people's lives easier by delivering a system that works for them.
Very good point. And I would agree. Oftentimes developers like to play with those new features, and that can result in some complexities that aren't necessarily justified from a budget perspective, right? Or just a technical and ongoing support perspective. And I've encountered that several times myself, where the customer just needs a basic solution to get the job done. They don't care that it's using the latest and greatest whiz-bang features behind the scenes, because guess what? They will literally never see it. Now, if some of those features help with maintainability, supportability, future-proofing, yes, there's a trade-off there. But just getting the basic functionality to help the customer improve their business process or get the job done or stop wasting time or whatever the case is. Yep. If you can achieve that, that's often a win in itself, and you do not need to impress anyone with your code. So
correct. Good point.
Very cool. Well, thank you both for joining me. It was a great discussion, and Inge and I are going to work on kind of distilling this, shall we say, into a presentation format in the hopes that this is of interest for the participants of DynamicsCon conference. So thanks for watching, and thank you both for joining me. And
thanks for having us.
Have a great morning. Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Okay.
Great.
Take care.
Let's see. Okay.
Bye.